To this third week class, online class. Before I will proceed with the continuation of our class today, allow me to address few questions. Number one is a question given by Suzali Muhammad, and the question is: could you please explain a relationship?
Recording in progress.
Could you please explain the relationship of Islamization of knowledge as promoted by the proponents of Islamization of knowledge? People are familiar with those names. Now, of course, this is a contested concept, Islamization of knowledge, how it is understood by different proponents. But in order for us not to go in detail on the debates on the Islamization of knowledge, it is more beneficial for all of us to look at the commonalities of the different approaches and how Islamization of knowledge have taken place in this new era. And what I can say is that all the advocates of Islamization of knowledge believe that there is a problem, there is a crisis of the contemporary knowledge, and therefore, whatever the responses taken by those proponents and the followers are actually responses to the challenges posed by modern knowledge. And what is the common ground? The common ground is the concept of Tawheed as the foundation of their ideas. Unlike in the Western worldview, Western philosophy, the core values could be different from one period to another period. But please take note that advocates of Islamization of knowledge, it could be Al-Attas, Al-Faruqi, Abu Sulaiman, and the others. We have to take into consideration that Tawheed is regarded as the foundation of in their deliberation of what philosophy or what a worldview is all about. Now, of course, the only major fundamental difference can be attributed to the process and the methodology of Islamization. Now, but the way I look at it as a student of Islam who had been molded in IIUM, I can see that there is a possibility of reconciliation. We have to look at the possibilities of reconciliation rather than looking at advocates as totally different from one another, as in the case of modernism and postmodernism. Now, yes, another important reflection that we have to clearly recognize is the understanding of the logical order of knowledge. The logical order of knowledge. Definitely, advocates of this Islamization of knowledge may look at the sequence, the order of the knowledge. It might be different from one person to another person. Who is qualified or not qualified? All of them are qualified to talk about the theory of integration, the theory of, the concept of practices in Islam, and the concept of spirituality. And, and at the same time, I have to say that Islamization of knowledge has to be acknowledged and it has to be appreciated. Whatever the effort, like the effort of IIIT, effort of ISTAC, and the effort of other institutions who are also advocating Islamization of knowledge must be acknowledged. Then another question is about, this question is from Nuruddin. Thank you for such a wonderful question. And the question goes like this. In relation to UNDP Sustainable Goal on Poverty Eradication by 2030, derailed, what is your view on the recent published white paper by Chinese government that it has reduced domestic poverty by 98%? How does this shape our understanding on capitalist and Islamic approach on social justice? How do we relate Islamic approach on this matter? From Nuruddin. Now, in relation to our understanding of Islamic worldview, when it comes to this question about China white paper, or maybe we call it how China's new white paper defines development cooperation, especially in addressing poverty alleviation. Everybody knows what is the system of China, very much related to materialism, capitalism, socialist approach, and so on and so forth. But what we can say is that their ability to address the problem of poverty can be attributed to something to do with worldview, because this is something related to the new mindset in the people, the new mindset in the people, which means that people of China are able to learn new skills, new ways of making a living. And because of their exposure to the new normal, new phenomena, new social reality, then they are able to understand what is happening. And that is because of their understanding has been broadened, the perspective has become broadened. Then the government prioritize local development instead of the urban places. Then they explored rural developments across the country. And there is also a fundamental improvement of the ecological environment. And if you look at more details about this, I think this can be attributed to strategic approach, to its long-standing interest in the disaster approach. They are able to respond to the global humanitarian challenges, and that is because China are able to really contain the problem. And that is, you can understand that when it comes to the COVID-19. And there is also a growing interest in engaging in humanitarian action. And this humanitarian action, I think we have clarified that in Islam, as an ideology, as a culture, as a civilization or worldview, humanitarian action is very much taken as a very important idea that it should be instilled into the mind of the people. Then another third question is about how Islamic worldview in understanding the book of nature is different from the belief of modern science, which does not believe that knowledge about the existence of God and God's will for human cannot be found by science. Which means this is a question from Jamalia, a PhD candidate of University of Technology. And yes, what I can say is, Sister Jamalia, Dr. Jamalia, is that, you see, when it comes to science, although modern science is based on a set of philosophy, ideas, which we believe it is not rooted from religion or from the ethical values of a religious belief. But however, when science has reached the pinnacle, the maturity and so on, based on a proper methodology, approaches and so on, then if that science has reached the perfect stage, then we can say that we can argue that there is no contradiction with what is being claimed in Islam, because as long as it doesn't go out, it doesn't contradict with religious understanding, then from our perspective, there is no clash, there is no conflict between human rationalism, or meaning idea that is developed by human reasoning, if that reasoning is guided by universal truth, something like that. And another question here, if I may, is about is dialogue between worldview possible? Wouldn't this be difficult if each had a different presupposition? If referring to Husserl, it is possible for someone to carry out delaying epoch process. The question here is about the possibility of a kind of dialogue between two opposing worldviews. We must understand that we are living in a diverse society, multicultural, multi-religious pluralism, if we may use the term. That is something inevitable that the science of worldview, the philosophy, should be able to aid man in order to coexist with the others. So there are, of course, issues related to epistemology, the core foundation of worldview, unresolved epistemological clash. Because what is happening in this 21st century is that there is a clash, there is a clash of civilization, but that civilization, the clash, is related to the clash of ideas. Now, in order to avoid the unresolved class of ideas, the root of the class of ideas, then it is very timely for each and every one of us to address such kind of clash. Then we have to come forward. Those who are fully aware of how to address the issue, then we have to come forward. That is the reason why we are organizing this online class, so that Muslims around the Muslim world are able to address the problem of the Ummah today. And this is our strength. Our strength is the clarity of vision, the clarity of ideas. Once we attain that kind of clarity, then we are able to address our problem in a very efficient manner. So those are the questions being posed last meeting. And Alhamdulillah, I hope I am able to answer them. And let us proceed with the continuation of my presentation today. And allow me to share with you my slides. Okay, this is actually, please take note, I am representing here two educational institution, Muslim institution. I am from International Islamic University. At the same time, IIIT country representative for the Philippines. And those who are not familiar with me, please bear with me that inshallah, we'll try our very, very best to make as much as possible to make this class interactive. You can stop me anytime. Then I can respond if time admits, if it is possible at the same time. Now, I was looking at few matters. This is actually the fundamental matters and queries when it comes to the coverage of what worldview is all about. Now, worldview is not only a knowledge about how can we know in the field of epistemology, the theory of knowledge and practices. But as far as we know, understand from our side, from Islam, Islamic worldview or Western worldview should be able to answer every questions that is addressed by different sciences. Like, for example, in the case of cosmology, how far does the universe go? Did it have beginning, and will it have an end? And this is the area of cosmology. And it is quite unfortunate that due to uncertainties produced by Western scholars in the field of cosmology, it lead humanity towards a particular perspective, and that leads to a kind of uncertainty. Now, how was it we human came about here on Earth? And this is the field of anthropology. It is quite unfortunate that Darwinism concept of the origin of species for decades and decades have confused man, especially in social science. How does life have a purpose? If it does, what can give meaning to my life? This is the area of teleology. Uh, does my daily conduct matter in the long run? Okay, and it tells us about the purpose, the goal of life. What happens to me at my death? This is the field of eschatology. What is going to happen in the world, which is the unseen? And um, worldview must be able to answer your question, what would happen. And we Muslims are very fortunate because our Islamic worldview have provided us a very precise understanding, clear idea, and who provided us all these kind of answers? It is God. It is God. That's the reason why Islamic worldview is based on the concept of God, unity of God, and this lead us into the so-called certainty. Okay, and all these particular different disciplines of knowledge that is in our slide now, axiology, for example, ontology, and so on. All these disciplines are able to provide man from the intellectual history of Islam a very precise knowledge culture. As a result of that, no one can deny that Muslims have been the pioneers of different disciplines, from ranging from mathematics, logic, astronomy, and so on. Name all those disciplines, and because of this precise rule of Islamic worldview that it played into in shaping the so-called intellectual tradition of Islam. And moving on. Okay, there are three notes on the terminology when it comes to understanding what worldview is all about. There are three categories of belief about the world. This is from the perspective of Western worldview. Uh, Ontology, epistemology, and methodology. When it comes to ontology, what can be, what exists, what is real, what exists in society, what is worth looking for. Now, what we understand from the ontological understanding of this is the confinement of what is something measurable, what can be perceived by the senses, and so on and so forth. So that is actually the main basis, the main limitation of what ontology from Western point of view. Now, what does it mean to know something? Okay, what is knowledge? What can be known? What kind of knowledge is valid and reliable? What are limits of knowledge? What is the relationship between knower, the researcher, for example, and the known? So from the perspective of epistemology, again, what I can say is that what type of knowledge can be valid? You know, any knowledge that is beyond human perception, or knowledge that is considered as under the category classification of the unknown thing, and therefore it cannot be measured. It cannot be, shall I say, cannot be measured by, for example, observation, experimentation, and cannot be subjected from that method. Then, epistemologically speaking, that particular knowledge is invalid. So when you talk about akhirat, which is the strong basis of Islamic understanding about what is going to happen in the hereafter, from Western epistemology, that is an invalid type of knowledge, that you should not spend much time in investigating it because it cannot be measured. Then how can we obtain information? How do we know the word? How do we gain this knowledge? This is related to the tools and techniques of research. Now, this is about methodology. Talking about worldview, talking about philosophy and so on, basically, unlike the one I have presented just now, and I want to just to show it to you again, cosmology, anthropology, and axiology, and so on. But reducing it into three is actually a big issue. Because if you're only looking at ontology, epistemology, and methodology, in comparison with what we have explained earlier, then you can see that Islamic philosophy, Islamic worldview is more comprehensive as compared to the contemporary worldview of today. Now, I have already explained these, the objectives of the worldview, looking at this ability to something, explain, ability to know, ability to construct, ability to develop. Now, worldview is a kind of instrument, a kind of tools, a kind of empowerment that would empower man, not only at the cognitive level, but at the same time, the most important empowerment is the intuitive aspect of understanding a thing, which means
later on diorang jumpa balik and
Dr. Alizaman, please unmute. We accidentally mute you. Please unmute again.
Okay.
Okay, there you go.
Okay. It's okay? Can you hear me now?
Hello? Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, totally.
Okay,
yes.
Okay. Now let's proceed with this one. What I am trying to say here is I was giving a kind of comparison between the two. So what I can say is that Islamic worldview and philosophy is more comprehensive because of the varied various classification of knowledge that we can find in the intellectual tradition of Islam. So that is the niche, that is the strength that we have in our intellectual history. So please convince yourself that knowing your worldview, knowing the very basis of your philosophical understanding is actually a kind of shall I say, motivating force that will make you more confident by telling yourself that I need to go back to the Torah. I need to look at the past because there is a certain point of historical processes that Muslims were able to respond to the various problems faced by Muslim leaders, intellectuals, and they were able to respond very positively. And the way they responded was very instrumental in transforming Muslim into a kind of culture, civilization, which cannot be surpassed until today. And that particular uniqueness, the feature, the salient feature of that institution, civilization, is something that you have to be very proud of. And that can be attributed because of a clear understanding of what worldview is all about. Now, let us move on. Thank you. There are many people who are coming now. This classification of worldview, there are, I can say that the worldview can be classified into two classification: religious worldview and non-religious worldview. Let me very briefly classify these two worldviews into religious and the non-religious. Now, the first one here, when you talk about reveal and preserve, this refers to the to Islam. It is a revealed religion, and the teachings were preserved because it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who promised that the ayats, the Quranic verses, ayat in the Quran will be preserved by him until the end of the time. Then another one is revealed worldview, but it has been interpolated. This refers to Judaism and Christianity. Everybody knows the fact that Christianity and Judaism were subjected to different level of distortion made by man. And because of the mixture of man's worldview and God's worldview, then there is a necessity for clarifying it by, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala send the last message of Allah, and that is the Quran, received by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, another type of worldview from under the category of religious worldview is not revealed. Not revealed here, which means those religions, like in the case of Buddhism, Hinduism, and other religion, Oriental religions, these religions were developed by man. It is a man-made worldview or man-made philosophy, which is actually based on human wisdom. A good example of this is in Buddhism. You know how Siddhartha Gautama Buddha had experienced the so-called enlightenment in sitting under the tree, the Bodhi tree, and because of a proper method of meditation, not through starvation, because starvation he did not succeed, but through a proper method of meditation, then he gradually achieved such kind of spirituality, enlightenment. And out of that enlightenment, then he shared his idea, wisdom to his disciples and so on. So those disciples were responsible of spreading the principles, the dogmas, the creeds of Buddhism. And same thing goes to Sikhism. These religions, this particular religion is again a product of human wisdom. Okay. Now the problem, the big issue that had created a chaos, a kind of a challenge in the discipline of knowledge, is the non-religious worldviews. And this can be attributed to the prevalence of secularism, modernism, postmodernism, agnosticism. Now, what does it mean here by secularism, and what are the main characteristics of this non-religious worldview? We can say that the main characteristic of this is the denial denial of the concept of God. All these non-religious worldview, they do not believe in the existence of God in a different level. For example, you can say that agnosticism and atheism, although it's to some people may think that agnosticism is quite similar with atheism. Of course, these agnostic worldviews and atheistic worldviews had brought into the so-called materialism, positivism, rationalism, and scientism. Just would like to mention, for example, when it comes to materialism, materialism is the main what is it? the main characteristics of Western worldview, materialism. And there are few characteristics of what materialism is all about. Like, for example, when matter is understood as everlasting, that may substitute the concept of Islamic concept of awalun and akhirun, the first and the last, because matter from that perspective cannot be extinguished. There is no end. And if the matter has no end and it has no beginning, because of the concept of primordial atom, for instance, the concept of primordial atom, then atom is has replaced the concept of God, because we understand that Allah, God, is the first and the last. Okay, and that is the concept. Then the positivism, Auguste Comte, a well-known sociologist, you know how he categorized science into, for example, theology, metaphysics, and positivism. And the emergence of positive science, which means before positive science, like for example, the first one and the second stage, those first and the second stage are not positive science, because the concern or the main objective of knowledge is something that cannot be measured, something that cannot be verified. And what is the discipline of positivism is something that can be observed, that can be measured by through systematic methodology. So this is how sociology had benefited from positivism. Of course, rationalism also in philosophy, especially in philosophy, and to some extent, when you look at from our experience in Islam, in the 7th to 11th, I think 9th century, the ascendancy of rationalism, how it becomes the main ideology of Islam. And until finally, because of the extreme rationalism, then it has been questioned by Ash'arites, then Maturidians, and so on and so forth. So until finally, what happened to Islam is that the rationalistic dimension of Islam was later on being synthesized or being harmonized by Muslim scholars. And therefore, the conflict between revelation and reason has already been addressed by the Muslim in the classical time, that we Muslim of today should not actually emphasize more on this conflict between, for example, the Ash'arites and the Salafis and so on. Because as far as we are concerned, the conflict between the two have already been addressed and so on. Then moving on the concept of philosophical worldviews. Okay, philosophical worldviews. I can say that the constructivism, the positivism, and the pragmatism, advocacy or participatory. Let me explain this because we are looking at philosophical worldview, scientism, and religious worldview. Very briefly, I hope we can benefit from defining this term and later on. Now, from the perspective of positivism or post-positivism, when I talk about ontology, there is an objective reality which can be accessed. So this is the issue about the conflict, as I mentioned before, the problem of objectivity and subjectivity. So objective reality, okay, you don't talk about subjective. Reality is independent of our experience of it, and it is accessible through careful thinking, observing, recording of experience. So, what do we mean by reality is independent of our experience? Some to us, as a Muslim, the reality is something that you have to experience it by yourself, But sometimes, from this perspective, you know, uh, as uh, as an individual who wanted to know the reality through careful thinking, observing, recording of experience, then sometimes because of the philosophical underpinnings of positivism, then reality is regarded as independent of our experience. Now, positivistic inquiry aims to explain, predict, or control reality. Or contrary, what does it mean by explain, predict, or control reality? Now, another one is strives towards measurability, objectivity, reduction of uncertainty. So here, what do I mean here is, the reality is being reduced. So this is the issue of reductionism, that I think you learn it from the explanation of Prof. Hazizan and other professors who are discussing, for example, Moliadi also explained the problem of reductionism in the Western philosophy, which means reducing the truth into a superficial manner. For example, that you have been presented before you what can be conceived, what is sensible to your senses. And sometimes what is being perceived by your senses could be partially true. And this is the problem of positivism and post-positivism. As a student or as a graduate of sociology, I'm very aware of some of the limitation of how sociologists understand social realities. Okay, especially on their obsession to understand social realities based on the fieldwork, based on the structured questionnaires. And I will give you a good example of the problem of structured questionnaire. If the questionnaires are not properly tested for psychologists who are trained about experimentation, then you have to test first the questions. So what would happen if the questions were not run and not been examined by expert on different discipline? And what would happen to your studies if your questions are based on a wrong preposition, wrong assumption, and you collected data which are not supposed to be collected because it is not relevant to your study? And this is the problem of positivism. And moving on in the constructivism, reality is socially constructed, which means there is no single truth, but rather multiple truth. This is again another problem because pluralism is the issue here, that there is no single truth, there is always a plurality of the truth. Reality is shaped by social factors. When you talk about social factors, it could be related to class, gender, ethnicity, culture, and so on and so forth. So which means the time and space varied from one place to another place. So what is the reality in one place is not actually the reality in another place. And that particular understanding gives us a problem. Like, for example, sociologists and anthropologists who interpreted in Islam based on this constructivism perspective, then they were responsible of confusing Islam because they see Islam, Indonesian Islam, Turkish Islam, Malay Islam, and so on and so forth. And this is because of this problem created by worldview of the contemporary society. Now, reality is not rooted in nature, but is a product of our own making. Okay, we cannot deny that, of course, reality may be related to what is actually the product of social activities and so on. But we must understand it is beyond that. Okay, it is beyond that. Then research is subjective process due to active involvement of the researcher in the construction and conduct of research. Okay, so please look at research as subjective process due to the active involvement of who? The researcher in the construction and conduct of research. So sometimes it is inevitable that what is the rule of the researcher may determine what is the result of the studies. Okay, and lastly, explores the ways people interpret and make sense of their experiences. Okay, now moving on another concept, interpretivism. Okay, there are 4 points here that I would like to share with you because the time is moving very fast. They are interested in every lives in the social world. Okay, worldview, they are looking at the everyday lives in the social world. People act on the basis of meanings. Okay, what does it mean? People act on the basis of meanings. This meaning is influenced by what, for example? So sometimes in their own interpretation and sometimes the other's interpretation. Now, why I'm bringing this? Because later on, when we define naturalism and other isms, so you understand how individuals and how society gives a meaning to a particular phenomena. Researchers' rule is to grasp meanings of people's action, interpret word from point of the participants. That is the purpose, aims of a researcher. The rule is to grasp and understand. The aims of empathic understanding and interpretation of human behavior. So interpretivism, that is the rule that they are supposed to give a proper interpretation of human behavior. Okay, now by looking at this, I can say that philosophical worldview, as I had mentioned just now, will give you a different dimension, trying to provide us a logical way of understanding the reality. The same thing when it comes to scientific worldview. When I talk about scientific worldview, it deals on, for example, the relationship of different variables. Okay, it gives you assumptions, but it doesn't give you a precise answer to a particular question. Like, for example, what is the origin of the universe? The scientific worldview come up with shall I say, set of assumptions and speculations and so on and so forth. But this is conditioned by properly understanding the relationship between dependent variable and independent variables. What caused a particular circumstance, for example. So the concept of causes, for instance. Okay, in philosophy, the first cause and those kind of concepts from Greek understanding. I am not the right person to deal with that perspective, but what I can say here is that scientific worldview basically will not provide us a very, very precise understanding, reality of the thing. Now, unless that science had reached a maturity which is actually in conformity with the truth claimed by Islam. Now, religious worldview, I have already mentioned to all of you here the example of Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and other man-made religion. Now, moving on, since I have 15 minutes to go, what I can say here, therefore, please take note on these 3 important points. A good worldview should provide logical, rational, and objective historical, civilizational evidence to offer man a more meaningful vision and to instill in him a sense of purpose. Okay, that is what worldview is all about. It must provide you a logical, rational, objective, historical, civilizational evidence that provided us a vision, okay, a sense of purpose, and so on. Now, we have to accept the fact that any beliefs that contradicts with the laws of nature, the patterns of society, history, scientific, historical facts, and human nature will not last. A good example of this is communism. Okay, because of some of the ideas of communism are contradictory to, for instance, human nature, then it did not last. And I believe that capitalism, because of some elements in the capitalism which is actually contradictory to universal principle, okay, then they are going to collapse. And I think what is happening now is giving us a clear idea that the global power is losing a grip when it comes to economic strength, and later on, most probably, cultural influences or cultural hegemony, and later on, military hegemony. Okay, it must also allow man to see himself through different stages in this world and in the hereafter. Now, what do we mean by this? A worldview should be able to give you a right intellectual and religious window to see yourself in different stages. Are you able to see, realize what is your position in the present, your life today? Now, you are in 40s, you are in 50s, 60s, and so on. I'm in the 50s. Then through my clear understanding, very little understanding of Islam, Alhamdulillah, that little understanding that I have, I am able to see my life in a particular stage and what is my role in this world. And that particular rule in this world, if I succeed, then there will be a kind of reward that will be given to me by, of course, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that will secure me a very good place in the hereafter. Now, that vision, that your ability to perceive yourself in particular particular position, and that could be the rule of worldview. That could be the rule of philosophy. That why we are learning this worldview and philosophy, not to complicate matters, not to make simple thing very complex, but worldview philosophy is to provide us a more clearer, to clear doubts, to provide us, as I mentioned before, clarity of vision with the proper methods. Okay, so moving on. Let me look at this preview. I want to have, I have 10 minutes here to provide you a preview before we proceed on a detailed understanding of worldview. Now, I want to introduce to you, next meeting, we will come up with a detailed of this naturalism. So, as a preview, please understand that naturalism argues that reality is exhausted by nature, containing nothing supernatural, and scientific methods should be used to investigate all areas of reality, including human spirit. Now, what does it mean that reality is exhausted by nature? Which means, reality, you can understand it through clarifying through your knowledge of the nature, because it suggests that the ideology or the philosophy or worldview suggests that nothing is so-called supernatural. What do you mean by supernatural? Supernatural here is, it's beyond being as man. It is supernatural. And the scientific method What do we mean by scientific method? I have already provided you what does it mean by scientific method. Scientific method means that can be measured, that can be studied by experimentation, by observation, and so on. So all these scientific methods should be used to investigate all realities, which means the reality is actually to be approached by intellectual faculties, but to be approached by, shall I say, by senses that man possesses. Okay, point number 2, most contemporary philosophers accept naturalism, characterized by the rejecting supernatural entities. Now, which means philosophers today accept naturalism. There is no secular philosopher who do not accept naturalism, because that is the root, that is the foundation of what Western ideology and philosophy is all about. Now, we have 2 important points here: rejecting supernaturalism, and number 2, allow that science is possible route, if not necessarily the only one, to important truth about human spirit. Okay, so this is actually how naturalism allows science as the only method, as the only way to approach the truth, especially even when it comes to human spirit. So human spirit, which is the domain of something unseen, then science, it's not about religion who can understand it. It must be through science. Investigating human spirit can be approached through science. Okay, the self-proclaimed naturalists from the period of John Dewey, these are the proponents of naturalism. We have to understand Dewey, Ernst, Nagel, Sidney Hook, Roy Wood, Sellars. So for students who are serious about learning naturalism in detail, especially on John Dewey, please refer to books written by John Dewey to have a more detailed understanding of what naturalism is all about. Now, another very important concept to understand what worldview is all about is secular humanism. Allow me to say a few words on this matter. I have 8 minutes remaining. Okay, number 1, a system of secular humanism refers to a system of values and beliefs that are opposed to the values and beliefs of traditional religions. Now, secular humanism here refers to a system of values and beliefs. Now, we are not saying that modernism or secular thoughts have no ethical system. They do have ethical system, but those ethics that they uphold are totally in opposition against traditional religions. So anything that is traditional, anything that is religious, is against the principle of secular humanism. Now, number 2 is worldly things are distinguished from things related to church and religion. This is the concept of the separation of the church and the state. Okay, what does it mean, a separation of the church and the state? What is the church is something religious, and that is the private affairs of man, and the state is related to the public domain, public activities of man. When a man who is a Christian, who is a secular humanist, when he deliberate policies and so on, then religious influences, religious ideas should not be reflected in the policy that they crafted. Okay, that's the meaning. Now, any system of thought or action based on the nature, interests, and ideals of man. So, secular humanism is by nature man-centered. It is not theocentric, God-centered, but it is anthropocentric approach. Anthropocentric approach. Why is it? Because the interests and the ideals are based on the ideals of man. Okay, and yes, specifically, secular humanism is non-theistic, which means uh, it is not based on God, rationalistic, capable of self-fulfillment, which means extreme reliance on man rationality, because man is independent, man is capable of arriving at the truth without the help of tradition, without the help of religion. The ethical conduct, of course, the ethical conduct, they have the ethics, but without recourse to the so-called supernaturalism. Now, at the beginning in the 1930s, this is a brief understanding of what happened in secular humanism. You have to understand that humanism was generally used in the religious sense by ethical movement in the U.S. in the early part of the 20th century, and that particular movement in the U.S. was not favored among the non-religious group in the Britain, in the UK, for example. Then postmodernism. I have 5 minutes to handle with this issue before this is the last points. Then we can come up with 5 minutes question and answer for that. Postmodernism. Allow me to say that postmodernism. When you talk about postmodernism, there is the difference between postmodernism as one word and postmodernism separated by the das. Okay, so postmodernism is one concept. Then with the das is another concept. We'll explain it later on as the difference between the two. But let us look at postmodernism as a one term. Okay, and it appeared in the Philosophical Lexicon in 1979. And who are these proponents, like, for example, Loitard? Okay, it is not a new concept. It emerged, of course, it evolved somewhere in the 6th and 17th century and later on in the 20th century. Okay, what is the main characteristics of this? It rejects objectivity. There is hierarchies of values, challenges grand narratives, okay, promotes the need to understand and recognize inherited biases from historical power. It is criticized for extreme relativism. Later on, we talk about the problem of relativity, cultural relativity, and so on and so forth. Sure. Then the main point here is cultural postmodernism is characterized by the concept of skepticism. Skepticism, they don't simply accept truth. They are always skeptical to that. Then subjectivism or relativism, a general suspicion of reason. Whatever reason that is forwarded to them are always been questioned, okay, and so on. Acute sensitivity to the rule of ideology. This is the problem, because they are always having a kind of a sensitive rule on. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay then. So here, inshallah, next meeting, I hope I am able to bring you a kind of preview of the concepts that I am going to look at by next meeting. These are the three concepts: materialism, secularism, and postmodernism, that I'm going to look at by 1 hour for that. And that is my concept. Then I will stop there. Then I'll move to Islamic worldview, characteristic of Islamic worldview, and so on and so forth, inshallah. And yeah, what I said just now is that by next meeting, we look at your assignment for those who are following me. We will look at naturalism in detail, then modernism or secular humanism in detail, then postmodernism. Then why we are providing this? because the purpose is to really appreciate, recognize the fact that the cause, the main culprit for the problems of contemporary knowledge was created by this different ideologies in the Western intellectual history. So if we want to address those problems, then we should have a very clear understanding of what are the elements that we need to diagnose, we need to Islamize, we need to integrate if we want to integrate. So, okay, therefore, thank you so much. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, Dr. Ali. Thank you for your explanation on the matters on Islamic philosophy and worldview. Do you want to take a question, or maybe you want to answer it next class?
We can ask our big sheikh here, since he is here. What is, because the time also.
Yes.
If just like now, if there are questions and you can send it to me, then by next meeting, just like what I have done, then I will be able to answer them in a structured manner, maybe.
Okay,
so
I think it's
We take it
better
next
like
time.
that.
Okay.
So that the answer will be more structured. Okay, thank you very much to all participants that asking the question and still be with us until for 1 hour. Thank you, Dr. Ali, for your lecture, and we will end here for today, and we will meet tomorrow again for the next courses. Inshallah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.